Greetings, everyone. And so we come to the last two short stories that we will read for the semester. It's very easy to talk about D.H. Lawrence and Catherine Mansfield sort of together. They have a lot in common. They knew each other. They were friends. Obviously, that means they lived around the same time and they ran in some of the same literary circles. They were both part of the modernist literary scene in Great Britain during and after the time of World War I. They both have connections to Germany, and they both died of tuberculosis, like so many other people we've talked about this semester. So, D.H. Lawrence was born in 1885. He was the youngest child of an industrial family. His father was a miner. His mother worked in a textile factory. He was raised in Nottingham County in Britain, and his home was actually near Sherwood Forest. If those names don't mean anything to you, they are the central setting for the Robin Hood stories. He was an excellent student. When he was 16 years old, he left home to go work as a clerk. He had to quit because he got sick. And he, like so many authors that we've covered this semester, would struggle with his health for the rest of his life, essentially. During this period, while he was recovering, he became friends with a local neighbor who had a great library collection and inspired D.H. Lawrence's love of literature and love of books and love of writing. At 21, he became a teacher. During this time, he began writing and developing much of his work. At 23 years old, he left Nottingham and went to London. After submitting several stories to the English Review, he was commissioned to write a story specifically, and that story ended up being Odor of Chrysanthemums. So, Odor of Chrysanthemums was one of Lawrence's first well-known work. He wrote Odor of Chrysanthemums in 1909, but it wouldn't get published until 1911. 1911 was also the year that his first novel was written, called The White Peacock. The next year, in 1912, he met Frida Weekly, who would go on to be his wife and life partner. And this kicked off a period of tremendous productivity and relative literary success for D.H. Lawrence throughout the rest of the decade of the 1910s. Although he was certainly a figure of controversy for most of his life, mostly due to a very, very vocal and well-known anti-war stance. Not just anti-war, but also anti-military. And considering the fact that he was married to a German woman, during the period of World War I in Britain, he was under a heavy amount of public scrutiny and personal trouble and interpersonal conflict. And so after World War I ended, D.H. Lawrence left Britain and would never really live there again for the rest of his life. He and Frida basically spent the rest of his life, at least, traveling the world, all throughout Europe, traveled to Australia and New Zealand, traveled to the United States, would end up dying in France. In addition to his anti-war stance, he was also very controversial in the sense that many of his works were considered obscene, and his work was frequently the subject of censorship and obscenity trials. In 1915, his novel The Rainbow was banned for a period of about 11 years, primarily for its very frank portrayal of sex and the presence of sex in that novel as a positive motivational force in a character's life. And then in 1928, his novel Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned. Once again, it was banned for its frank depictions of sex and sexuality. Lady Chatterley's Lover was also criticized for its use of profanity, specifically the word fuck. There, I just said it. Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned not just in Britain, but in Australia and Canada and Japan and India and the United States. In fact, in the United States, it wasn't available for almost 30 years. Lady Chatterley's Lover was published in 1928, which was 2 years before he died, and so it ended up being his final fully written novel that was published during his lifetime, and he would spend most of those 2 years while he languished in ill health from tuberculosis writing defenses of his work, not necessarily apologizing, but declaring that what he wrote was intended to be very positive and very uplifting and beautiful. Nevertheless, many people in the English-speaking political world declared Lady Chatterley's Lover to not only be obscene, but downright pornographic, declared that it was completely devoid of any kind of redeeming artistic value and would heavily impugn D.H. Lawrence's character as a person and as an individual. In the years since its publication, in the years since Lawrence has died, in the years since the ban has been lifted, most of Lawrence's work has actually sold surprisingly well, and there's been many key literary figures, such as E.M. Forster, try to rehab Lawrence's image and reputation in the literary world, and now D.H. Lawrence is a staple of the English literary modernist canon. Because Lawrence comes from a lower class background, many of his books center around lower class issues or class identity and class awareness and struggle. The title character of Lady Chatterley's lover is a man who is like a mason. He makes not statues, but makes like pedestals for statues and such. Meanwhile, Lady Chatterley herself was a very upper class aristocratic woman, and so her affair was beneath her station, and the controversy. Obviously, Odor of Chrysanthemums is nothing if not a very frank depiction of the working class life, and specifically the extent to which an individual in an industrialized world becomes part of the machinery himself. The characters in Odor of Chrysanthemums are in many ways very robotic, very automaton-like in the way that they go about living their days. The central character is a woman named Elizabeth who is raising her kids at home while waiting for her husband to come home from work. And her home is depicted as being basically a cinder block house right beside a train track in an industrial section of town. You can see the neighborhood being described where all the houses are basically right up against each other. People on their way home from work are essentially walking right past her house. We see her interact with people in a way that is very mechanical and very emotionless. When her father comes by, she has nothing really to say to him. He mentions to her that he's gotten married after the death of her mother and hasn't necessarily told her, and yet we are also assumed to believe that this ceremony of her bringing him bread and butter as he stops by on his way home from work is something that they do often enough, and so they see each other frequently, but they don't really engage. And the way that she interacts with her children and with her mother-in-law, it seems all very rote, very automatic. You get the sense that she spends most of her day sort of doing the same things. Also, the way that she assumes that the reason her husband hasn't shown up by the midpoint of the story and by the end of the first section is that he's just gone off drinking. And she expects that in a couple of hours more, he'll stagger home drunk, having stopped off at the pub on the way home from work like he usually does, and doesn't really even get a sense of panic or concern until a number of hours have passed and her husband still hasn't gone home. And then when she learns that her husband has in fact died, and that he has died and left her not only with her two kids that we know and see in the story, but also a third kid that is on the way because she is pregnant. Elizabeth does not really mourn, she doesn't grieve, she simply ponders the future and ponders what her next move in her life will be. When the gentlemen bring the body to their house and she and her mother-in-law clean the body as it's laid there before her, they are preparing the body for a receiving of friends, as the tradition of someone dying is to leave the body in repose for a while so people can come by and visit and pay their respects. Elizabeth looked up. The man's mouth was fallen back, slightly open under the cover of the mustache. The eyes, half shut, did not show glazed in the obscurity. Life, with its smoky burning gone from him, had left him apart and utterly alien to her, and she knew what a stranger he was to her. In her womb was ice of fear, because of this separate stranger with whom she had been living as one flesh. Was this what it all meant? Utter, intact separateness obscured by heat of living? In dread she turned her face away. The fact was too deadly. There had been nothing between them, and yet they had come together, exchanging their nakedness repeatedly. Each time he had taken her, they had been two isolated beings, far apart from now. He was no more responsible than she. The child was like ice in her womb, for as she looked at the dead man, her mind, cold and detached, she said clearly, "Who am I? What have I been doing? I have been fighting a husband who did not exist. He existed all the time. What wrong have I done? What was that I had been living with? There lies the reality. This man, and her soul died in her for fear. She knew she had never seen him. He had never seen her. They had met in the dark and had fought in the dark, not knowing whom they met or whom they fought. And now she was, and turned silent and seeing, for she had been wrong. She had said he was something he was not. She had felt familiar with him, whereas he was apart all the while, living as she never lived, feeling as she never felt. In fear and shame she had looked at his naked body, and she had known falsely. And he was the father of her children. Her soul was torn from her body and stood apart. She had denied him what he was. She saw it now. She had refused him as himself. And this had been her life and his life. She was grateful to death, which restored the truth. And she knew she was not dead. He and she were only channels through which life had flowed to issue in the children. She was a mother, but how awful she knew it now to have been a wife. And he dead how awful it must have felt to be a husband. What you're hearing there, obviously, is the sort of mournful non-mourning of a wife or husband whom she never really had any real attraction to. They had lived essentially entirely separate lives and had really not done anything as one together except have kids. And in those last words, she describes herself as nothing more than a vessel through which life perpetuates itself. She is literally a cog in a machine, this machine that produces people. This is the sense of alienation that a lot of people who are concerned with the effects of industrialization on the humanness of a person. This is an alienation of a person to the rest of the world. The work that he does doesn't produce anything that he owns. He exchanges his bodily labor for money. The industrialized world places upon the natural world unnatural and artificial structures and means. And now here we have people who in this story are little more than conduits for a mechanization of the life process. They are not soulmates. They are two people who got together and then had children, and now one of them's dead and the other one is alive, and all they are is a parent. And she feels this child that is getting ready to be born inside her is just icy death. Industrialization has an alienating effect on an individual. They are alienated from themselves. They are alienated from the fruits of their own labor. They're alienated from each other. Now he's gone, and she is, as she says, she was, she is, she exists. And that's it. Moving on now to Catherine Mansfield, who was born in 1888 in New Zealand, in Wellington, New Zealand. Even though she's born in New Zealand, we're studying her in a British literature class because New Zealanders are essentially Brits who live on the other side of the world from Britain. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Despite all the things that she shares in common with D.H. Lawrence, unlike D.H. Lawrence, she was born in a very well-to-do and politically connected family. Her grandfather was a member of New Zealand Parliament. Her father ran the Bank of New Zealand, would end up getting knighted later in his life. Her mother was distantly related to British royalty, and so Catherine Mansfield came from quite literally the other side of the tracks to D.H. Lawrence. Mansfield attended very fine schools during her childhood and began writing early and began publishing her stories in her school's newspapers and magazines. In 1903, she left New Zealand and went to London to attend school at Queen's College. While she was there, she toured the continent. Interesting side note, or I don't know, maybe not interesting, but there's the stereotype of the college-age person who backpacks across Europe, and in our culture, that person is almost always just some upper-middle-class, douchey white kid from America who is just spending a summer backpacking across Europe. In Europe, that stereotype is people from Australia and people from New Zealand. I don't know, I learned that when I went to Germany and went up to Prague. They actually think that the southern accent sounds a lot like an Australian accent to them. They can't tell the difference. So everywhere I went, they thought I was Australian. Anyway, she toured the continent while she was at Queen's College between 1903 and 1906. After she finished her school, she went back to New Zealand and stayed there for another 2 years, would eventually go back to London and live there for the rest of her life. That 2 years that she spent there, she became very disillusioned with living in New Zealand. Most likely the greatest cause of that disillusionment for Mansfield was the fact that she, for 2 years, had a relationship with a Maori woman named Mahata Mahupuku. She was a descendant of Maori tribal leaders. The Maori people, if you don't know, are the natives of New Zealand. The Maori of New Zealand have experienced much what the natives of our own country have experienced here. White Europeans first came here, they brought with them first disease, to which the Maori had no immunity, and so a number of them were wiped out by disease shortly after white people first came to New Zealand. But then after that, it's disenfranchisement, it is broken treaties, it is decrease in social standing and social injustice. I mean, that's pretty much the story everywhere white Europe goes, I guess. Anyway, in 1908, Mansfield moves back to London, continues to spend a great amount of time on the continent. In terms of her career as an author, Mansfield is quite prolific. She's considered a key figure in the modernist short story genre. Her work at first was very traditional in the sense that her stories had likable characters and a noticeable arc and a satisfactory conclusion. And she was able to get some of that work published until 1910, 1911, when her publishers started requesting work that more reflected the contemporary modernist values of the literary scene at the time. In 1911, she published In a German Pension, which was her first collection of short stories, and in the decade between 1912 and her death in 1923, she would write and publish about 60 short stories. Also, perhaps unlike D.H. Lawrence, whereas Odor of Chrysanthemums was one of his first stories, The Garden Party was one of Mansfield's last stories. Published in 1922 in a collection titled The Garden Party. In 1917, she is diagnosed with tuberculosis, would spend the next 5 or 6 years struggling to find a place in a climate where she could live that would be salient to her disease. She moved to Bandol, France in 1922. She continued to write. It was there that she wrote The Garden Party, but her condition would worsen over the next year. She suffered from pulmonary hemorrhages. She underwent somewhat experimental and unorthodox cures. Then tuberculosis would claim her life in 1923. So another distinction between Mansfield and Lawrence is the stories that we are reading for them today. Lawrence's work is a very, very stark and drab depiction of the dehumanizing effects of industrialization. Mansfield's story is about, as I said before, life on the other side of the tracks. Mansfield's story is about the Sheridan family who are getting ready to have a party. They're having a party just because. The action of the story mostly takes place as the family is bustling about and as the staff of the family and the people that they've hired to come in and decorate and bring flowers and bring food. And the central character, Laura, is one of the younger daughters of the family, and she's someone who throughout the story seems to want to have, or believes that she has, some sort of connection with the people who are working for her family. It's also pretty clear that this connection that she feels with the workers is being hindered by the fact that her upbringing would suggest that that would be an unnatural kind of friendship. There's the moment when the gentlemen come to bring in the marquee. 4 men in their shirt sleeves stood grouped together in the garden path. They carried staves covered with rolls of canvas, and they had big tool bags slung on their backs. They looked impressive. Laura wished now that she had not got the bread and butter, but there was nowhere to put it, and she couldn't possibly throw it away. She blushed and tried to look severe, and even a little short-sighted as she came up to them. "Good morning," she said, copying her mother's voice, but that sounded so fearfully affected that she was ashamed and stammered like a little girl. "Oh, have you come? Is it about the marquee?" "That's right, miss," said the tallest of the men, a lanky, freckled fellow, and he shifted his tool bag, knocked back his straw hat, and smiled down at her. "That's about it." His smile was so easy, so friendly, that Laura recovered. What nice eyes he had, small but such a dark blue. And now she looked at the others. They were smiling too. "Cheer up, we won't bite," their smile seemed to say. How very nice the workmen were, and what a beautiful morning. "Well, what about the lily lawn? Would that do?" And she pointed to the lily lawn with her hand that didn't hold the bread and butter. They turned, they stared in the direction. A little fat chap thrust out his upper lip, and the tall fellow frowned. "I don't fancy it," he said. "Not conspicuous enough. You see, with the thing like a marquee," and he turned to Laura in an easy way, "you want to put it somewhere where it'll give you a bang slap in the eye, if you follow me." Laura's upbringing made her wonder for a moment whether it was quite respectful of a workman to talk to her of bangs slap in the eye, but she did quite follow him. And then later on, when they go on about their work, she's watching them. Already the men had shouldered their staves and were making for the place. Only the tall fellow was left. He bent down, pitched a sprig of lavender, put his thumb and forefinger up to his nose, and snuffed up the smell. When Laura saw that gesture, she forgot all about the Caracas in her wonder at him caring for things like that, caring for the smell of lavender. How many men that she knew would have done such a thing? Oh, how extraordinarily nice workmen were, she thought. Why couldn't she have workmen for friends rather than the silly boys she danced with and who came to Sunday night supper? She would get on much better with men like these. Her shock at the fact that a workman might enjoy for just a moment smelling a little bit of lavender, the fact that that is shocking to her, shows that she's very naive, but very sweet and very honest and well-meaning. But of course the key moment in the story is when they learn that one of their neighbors, who is a workman, was killed during the course of the day by getting thrown from his horse and landing on his head. When Laura hears that this tragedy has happened, and that it happened to someone who only lives just a short little walk away from them, prompts Laura in a bout of sympathy to feel like the family is wrong for wanting to have the party, and she suggests that the party be canceled, and everyone in the house acts like that's a crazy suggestion. Laura caught hold of her sister's sleeves and dragged her through the kitchen to the other side of the green baize door. There she paused and leaned against it. "Josie," she said, horrified, "however are we going to stop everything?" "Stop everything, Laura?" cried Josie in astonishment. "What do you mean?" "Stop the garden party, of course." Why did Josie pretend? But Josie was still more amazed. "Stop the garden party? My dear Laura, don't be so absurd. Of course we can't do anything of the kind. Nobody expects us to. don't be so extravagant. But we can't possibly have a garden party with a dead man just outside the front gate. And so she immediately says, well, we got to cancel the party, right? It would be such bad taste, and we can't have a party with our neighbors having gone through a tragedy, and everyone is completely stunned that Laura would even suggest and thinks that that's such a silly suggestion. And then as Laura starts to think about it, you can see how at odds she is with herself about this. The fact that she is showing sympathy for people that she doesn't really know beyond the fact of their status as their neighbor, while at the same time recognizing that their neighbors are of a different class than them, and the attitude that comes out of her is one that has been instilled in her by her upbringing. When she goes on, she says, that really was extravagant, for the little cottages were in the lane to themselves at the very bottom of a steep rise that led up to the house. A broad road ran between. True, they were far too near. They were the greatest possible eyesore, and they had no right to be in that neighborhood at all. They were little mean dwellings painted a chocolate brown. In the garden patches there was nothing but cabbage stalks, sick hens, and tomato cans. The very smoke coming out of their chimneys was poverty-stricken. Little rags and shreds of smoke so unlike the great silvery plumes that uncurled from the Sheridans' chimneys. Washerwomen lived in the lanes, and sweeps and a cobbler, and a man whose house front was studded all over with minute bird cages. Children swarmed. When the Sheridans were little, they were forbidden to set foot there because of the revolting language and of what they might catch. But since they were all grown up, Laura and Laurie on their prowl sometimes walked through. It was disgusting and sordid. They came out with a shudder. But still, one must go everywhere. One must see everything. So through they went. And so Laura is at conflict. She is bound by her feeling of human connection to her neighbors to feel like having a party would be in very poor taste. At the same time, everyone around her is telling her that that's a silly notion. And no one expects them to change what they're doing out of respect for these poor people who live down the road. So her mother comes in, and Laura says to her at one point, "Mother, isn't it terribly heartless of us?" "Darling!" Miss Sheridan got up and came over to her carrying the hat. She's got this hat that she wants Laura to wear for the party. Before Laura could stop her, she had popped it on. "My child," said her mother, "that hat is yours. It's made for you. It's much too young for me. I have never seen you look such a picture. Look at yourself." And she held up a hand mirror. "But mother," Laura began again. She couldn't look at herself. She turned aside. This time, Miss Sheridan lost patience, just as Josie had done. "You were being very absurd, Laura. People like that don't expect sacrifices from us. And it's not very sympathetic to spoil everybody's enjoyment as you're doing now." "I don't understand," said Laura. And then she walked quickly out of the room into her own bedroom. There, quite by chance, the first thing she saw was this charming girl in the mirror, and her black hat trimmed with gold daisies and a long black velvet ribbon. Never had she imagined she could look like that. Is mother right, she thought? And now she hoped her mother was right. Am I being extravagant? Perhaps it was extravagant. Just for a moment she had another glimpse of that poor woman and those little children, and the bodies being carried into the house, but it all seemed blurred, unreal, like a picture in the newspaper. "I'll remember it again after the party's over," she decided, and somehow that seemed quite the best plan. To recap, what seemed quite the best plan? To put the poor people out of their mind and go have fun at the party. That would be best for everybody involved. What's great about tackling these two stories in tandem is the way that they are kind of puzzle pieces in a way. You could very easily consider that the man who was lying dead in the house down at the bottom of the hill from the Sheridan's house might have actually been Walter, might have actually been Elizabeth's husband, or someone very much like him. Someone who died at work doing physical labor, someone who left a large family now to themselves, and the sheer detachment of it all of the upper class family that is the Sheridans. But Laura goes throughout the rest of the story feeling very giddy, and even when she takes the basket of their leftovers to the Scott's house and offers it to them, and she looks down at the dead body and she says, "Please excuse my hat." It seems to me that this hat is symbolic of some sort of recognition that Laura is having of the coldness of the situation, yet the fact that she's kind of become resigned to it at this moment. Her upbringing is winning. The concern that she had for the Scott family and the way that her family's party, being held right next door to this grieving family, might look, vanishes completely when she beholds herself wearing this hat in the mirror. And in the moment where she is confronting death and looking at Mr. Scott's dead body, she becomes very acutely aware of it at this moment. She knows that this is the thing that is keeping this from being something that I'm really, truly experiencing. The other thing that makes these two stories so good to compare and so good to cap off the short story portion of our modernism unit with is the fact that these two stories are modernist to the core, in the sense that neither of them really have a very satisfactory story arc and conclusion. These stories are doing what Robert Browning and Filippo Lippi were wanting to do with their art. If you think back to Filippo Lippi, there is that moment, and I won't quote from it because I don't have my book here in front of me, but there's that moment where he talks about how many times are you walking around and you go over a bridge and you don't think about the bridge and your mind doesn't even come across it. It's just something that you do and you behold and you pass without even really thinking about it thousands of times in your life as you go about and live day to day. But then if someone were to paint that bridge, you would be forced to stop and consider it for a second. You'd have to sit there and behold it. And you have to recognize that this thing that you pay no attention to might in and of itself have a certain amount of beauty and regalness, and it might be worth considering in a way other than you would as an object of utility that will get you from one side of the creek to the other on your way about your day. That was the thing that Filippo Lippi loved about painting, is the fact that it drew attention to details that most people didn't even recognize. This would be something that would typify the art form of photography. People started recognizing the power of a camera to capture moments that a person, as they're living their life, just walks right by, ignores, would never pay attention to if someone hadn't taken a photo of it. Both of these stories sort of function on that level. These are not stories about people falling in love and having a great time or going off on a tremendous adventure. These are things about people living their day-to-day lives. These are quite literally snapshots of the everyday lives of these people. These are moments of import, but these are also moments that flicker and burn and die and will never get back, except for the sake of having them captured in a story form. There is no lesson, there is no moral, there is no feel-goodness at the end of these stories. This is just life as it exists. Life in its most real and straightforward and perhaps gritty sense, but life nonetheless. And if life is beautiful, then even the ugly moments are worth capturing like this. The short story as a medium is about capturing episodes of life. It's less about creating a vicarious, emotional feeling that is powerful and moving, and much more about capturing details of life that get ignored all too often. And in a modernist sense, that becomes even more important because life post-industrial moves so quickly that you go in and out your life, and you go in and out of moments of real import and impact without ever realizing it at the time, perhaps. You're too busy, you're too distracted, there's too much shit going on that you've got your mind on for you to pay attention to the stuff that matters. And the short story is an art form uniquely built to capture those moments of import that really define us in terms of who we are as people. I think it's about to rain, so if Mother Nature's going to tell me to put a period on this, I'll do it. As always, love you, miss you, stay well, stay healthy, stay dry.